right, ready to dive into something really fascinating. We've got a whole stack of sources here, and they paint a pretty thought-provoking picture, almost like a warning about something called Munchausen syndrome by policy, but at scale. Ever heard of that?
Intriguing concept, isn't it? You're probably familiar with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where someone fabricates or exaggerates another person's illness for attention and control.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, these sources, they take that psychological concept and kind of apply it to entire societies.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. So we're not talking about like just one person who's a hypochondriac. We're talking about like a whole system that's designed to keep people feeling sick or scared.
Exactly. The sources argue that this Munchausen syndrome by policy at scale is a dynamic where leaders or institutions might actually create problems or blow existing ones way out of proportion, not to help people, but to solidify their own power.
So it's less about genuine solutions and more about never let a good crisis go to waste kind of thinking.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The sources point out that throughout history, leaders have used fear and crisis to consolidate power. But what's different now, they argue, is the scale and the sophistication of the methods.
Okay, so let's break that down a little. What exactly are these sources saying is happening?
Well, one of the key things they highlight is this idea of manufactured crises.
Okay.
They argue that certain events or threats are deliberately amplified, or even outright fabricated, to keep the public in this state of anxiety and dependence.
That does sound a little bit, I don't know, conspiratorial. Do they offer any specific examples of what they're talking about?
They do, and some of them are pretty provocative. For example, they analyze the response to the COVID-19 pandemic,
Okay.
arguing that while the virus was a legitimate threat, the fear surrounding it was intentionally heightened to justify policies that expanded government control in, well, unprecedented ways.
So are they saying that the virus wasn't a big deal?
Not necessarily. They acknowledge the seriousness of the pandemic, but they argue that the response, particularly the prolonged lockdowns and the suppression of dissenting voices
Oof.
in the scientific community, had more to do with power than with public health.
That's a pretty bold claim. What kind of evidence do they present to back that up?
Well, they cite things like inconsistencies in messaging from public health officials, the censorship of doctors and scientists who question the dominant narrative, and the enormous profits reaped by pharmaceutical companies during the pandemic.
Okay, so they're kind of pointing to this pattern of behavior that maybe suggests ulterior motives.
Exactly. And they argue that this pattern is repeating itself in other areas as well.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, another example they delved into is the issue of climate change. They acknowledge the reality of climate change, but argue that the rhetoric surrounding it has become, well, increasingly apocalyptic and alarmist,
Right.
creating this sense of panic that's being used to justify drastic policies with potentially devastating economic and social consequences.
So you're saying they think climate change is being used as a tool for control.
That's their argument. They suggest that this focus on impending doom distracts from practical solutions and encourages people to accept, well, any solution, no matter how radical or disruptive, as long as it promises to avert the crisis.
Yeah, that does sound familiar. Every time you turn on the news, it feels like the world is ending.
Precisely. And that's exactly the kind of atmosphere the sources argue is being intentionally cultivated. They point out that when people are afraid, they're more likely to surrender their freedoms and accept authoritarian measures in exchange for the illusion of safety.
So they're saying that fear is being weaponized, basically.
That's one way to put it. They argue that fear is a powerful tool for manipulation, and those in power are increasingly using it to control the population.
Okay, so if all of this is true, if this whole Munchausen syndrome by policy at scale thing is really happening, what can we do about it?
That's the big question, isn't it? And thankfully, our sources don't just leave us with a bleak diagnosis. They actually offer some potential solutions as well.
Okay, I'm all ears. It's getting a little bit heavy over here.
Well, one of the first things they emphasize is the importance of awareness.
Okay.
They argue that simply recognizing the patterns of manipulation, seeing how fear and crisis are being used to control us, is the first step towards breaking free.
Okay, so knowledge is power, as they say. But how do we get that knowledge?
They suggest that we need to be more critical of the information we consume, especially from mainstream media sources. They encourage us to seek out alternative viewpoints, to do our own research, and to question, well, everything.
So we need to become more skeptical, more discerning about what we believe.
Exactly. They argue that critical thinking is the antidote to manipulation.
Okay, I can see that. But critical thinking can be hard work. It's much easier to just accept what we're told.
That's true. But the sources argue that the stakes are too high to remain passive. They believe that the future of our freedom, and perhaps even our very survival, depends on our ability to think for ourselves and to resist manipulation.
Wow. Okay, so critical thinking is a good start. What else do they suggest?
Well, another thing they emphasize is the importance of community. They argue that strong communities built on trust and shared values can act as a buffer against the divisive tactics of those in power.
You mean like finding people who share our values and supporting each other?
Exactly. They believe that when we are connected to others, when we have a sense of belonging and purpose beyond ourselves, we are less susceptible to fear and manipulation.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's strength in numbers, as they say.
Right. And they also argue that communities can play a vital role in disseminating information and organizing resistance.
Interesting. So they're not just talking about emotional support, they're talking about taking action together.
Precisely. They believe that collective action is essential for challenging the power structures that are perpetuating this societal Munchausen syndrome.
Okay, so awareness, critical thinking, and community. Got it. What else?
Well, another key point they make is the importance of spiritual renewal.
Okay.
They argue that a society lacking a strong moral and spiritual foundation is particularly vulnerable to the kind of manipulation we've been discussing.
Wait, are they talking about religion here?
Not necessarily. They use the term spiritual in a broader sense, referring to a sense of meaning and purpose that transcends the material world.
Okay, so it's more about having a set of values, something to believe in, that gives you a sense of grounding.
Exactly. They argue that when people lack that strong inner compass, they're more easily swayed by external forces, by those who promise to provide meaning and security in exchange for obedience.
I see. So it's not just about fighting against bad ideas. It's about having something positive to believe in, something that gives you strength and resilience.
That's a great way to put it. They believe that a society that values truth, compassion, and individual freedom is much less likely to fall prey to the manipulations of the devouring mother or the destructive dragon.
Okay, this is starting to make more sense, but it's a lot to process. I'm curious, what did the sources have to say about the role of myths and fairy tales in all of this? I remember that being mentioned in the intro.
Yes. This is where things get really fascinating. The sources argue that these ancient stories, often told to children, actually contain profound warnings about the dangers of the devouring mother archetype and the manipulative tactics we've been discussing.
Whoa, really? So like classic fairy tales are actually social commentary.
In a way, yes. For example, they point to the story of Sleeping Beauty. Remember how Maleficent curses Aurora to sleep for 100 years?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They see that as a metaphor for the way that the devouring mother tries to keep her children in this state of perpetual childhood, dependent and under her control.
Interesting. So it's not just about a wicked fairy, it's about a deeper psychological dynamic.
Exactly, and they find similar themes in other stories as well. Take Snow White, for instance.
Okay.
The evil queen, with her obsession with beauty and control, is another example of the devouring mother archetype. Her desire to consume Snow White's youth and beauty represents the way the devouring mother tries to drain the life force from those around her.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. It's like these stories are warnings passed down through generations about the dangers of this archetype.
That's precisely what the sources argue. They believe that these stories contain this deep wisdom about human nature and the dynamics of power, and they suggest that by understanding these stories, we can better understand the challenges we face today.
Okay. So we've talked about the problem, this Munchausen syndrome by policy at scale, and we've touched on some potential solutions. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this actually plays out in the real world. Can you give me some concrete examples of how this dynamic is affecting our lives?
Of course. Let's start with the impact on education. The sources argue that the devouring mother dragon dynamic is having this profound impact on the way our children are being educated. They see this shift from critical thinking to indoctrination, where schools are becoming battlegrounds for ideological conflicts rather than places of genuine learning and inquiry.
Okay. Can you give me a specific example of what you mean?
Well, one area they highlight is the push for critical race theory in schools. They argue that while the intention may be to address racial inequality, the way CRT is often implemented actually reinforces racial divisions and promotes a victimhood mentality.
Okay, but isn't it important to teach kids about racism?
Absolutely. But the sources argue that CRT, as it's often taught, actually undermines the very values of equality and individual dignity it claims to promote.
Okay.
They suggest that by reducing individuals to their racial identities and focusing on past injustices, CRT fosters resentment and division rather than understanding and reconciliation.
Interesting. So they're not saying that racism isn't a problem. They're just questioning the effectiveness of this particular approach.
Exactly. And they see a similar dynamic at play in the way gender ideology is being introduced in schools. They argue that pushing these complex and controversial ideas about gender identity onto young children who are not developmentally ready to process them is a form of psychological manipulation.
So they see this as another example of the devouring mother, or the dragon dynamic at work.
Precisely. They argue that these ideologies, while often presented as progressive and liberating, are actually designed to undermine traditional values and create a generation of children who are, well, more malleable and compliant.
Hmm. That's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
What about the impact on families? I know the sources mention that as well.
Yes, they argue that the devouring mother-dragon dynamic is having this devastating impact on the family unit. They point to things like the rising divorce rates, the normalization of single-parent households, and the relentless attacks on traditional gender roles as evidence of this.
Okay. But haven't family structures always been evolving? What's different now?
They acknowledge that family structures have always been in flux, but they argue that the changes we're seeing now are not simply a result of natural social evolution.
Okay.
They believe that there is this deliberate agenda to undermine the family unit, which is seen as a threat to the power of the state and other institutions.
So they're saying that there's a reason why families are breaking down.
That's their argument. They believe that the weakening of the family unit is part of a larger strategy to create a society that is more atomized, more dependent on the state, and more susceptible to control.
Wow. That's a pretty disturbing thought. I'm starting to see how this devouring mother dragon dynamic could be playing out in so many different areas of our lives.
It is a pervasive dynamic, and it's not always easy to spot, but as we become more aware of the patterns, we can start to recognize it and take steps to resist it. Yeah, it really is a lot to think about. And while the scale of it can feel, I don't know, daunting, the sources actually offer some surprisingly practical ways to push back against this whole societal Munchausen by proxy thing.
Okay, good. I need some actionable advice after all that. Where do they suggest we start?
Well, they place a lot of emphasis on reclaiming language. You see, the devouring mother and the dragon, they thrive on twisting words and narratives to their advantage.
Okay, give me an example. How do they distort language?
Think about terms like safety, security, or even well-being. These words have, positive connotations, right?
Right, yeah.
But the sources argue they're often weaponized.
So something that sounds like it's for our own good might actually be a way to control us.
Exactly. The sources say we need to become much more aware of how these seemingly benign words are used to justify policies that erode our freedom or make us, more dependent.
That's pretty sneaky. So how do we fight back on that, like on that linguistic level?
They suggest two things. First, be more critical of the language used by those in power. Ask yourself, what are they really saying? What are the underlying assumptions here?
Okay.
And second, reclaim those words for yourself.
What do you mean reclaim them?
Define what true safety, security, well-being mean to you, independent of what authorities are pushing. Use those words in ways that empower you, not in ways that make you feel helpless or reliant.
Okay, I like that. It's about being more conscious of how language shapes our thinking. Speaking of shaping things, the sources also mention this whole 7 spheres of societal influence idea. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. This is their framework for understanding how this societal Munchausen syndrome permeates, well, every aspect of our culture. It's not just about politics, you see. It impacts, well, everything, from family to entertainment to even religion.
Whoa, okay. Break that down for me. What are these 7 spheres?
They are family, education, religion, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. The sources argue that the devouring mother dragon dynamic seeks to control each of these spheres to maintain its grip on society.
So it's like a virus, kind of spreading through all the major systems that make up our world.
That's a great analogy. And within each sphere, they highlight specific tactics that are used to manipulate and control.
Okay, can you give me some examples?
Of course. Let's take the sphere of family. The sources argue that the traditional family structure, with its emphasis on strong parental authority and clear moral boundaries, is seen as a threat to the devouring mother.
Because strong families are more independent, less likely to need the help of institutions.
Exactly. So they point to trends like the rising divorce rate, the normalization of single-parent households, and the push for alternative family structures as evidence of, well, a deliberate effort to weaken the family unit.
And by weakening families, they create more individuals who are dependent on the system.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, in the sphere of education, their analysis gets even more concerning.
Okay, what do they say is happening in schools?
They argue that the devouring mother sees education as a prime opportunity for indoctrination, shaping young minds to be compliant and unquestioning. They point to the rise of ideologies like critical race theory and radical gender ideology as examples of this.
So it's not about genuine education, but about molding kids into a certain way of thinking.
That's their argument. They believe that these ideologies are designed to instill a sense of, I don't know, guilt, shame, and victimhood, making children more susceptible to the solutions offered by those in power.
Okay, that's pretty bleak. What about the sphere of religion? I remember you mentioned that earlier.
Ah, yes, this is a fascinating one. The sources argue that the devouring mother actually sees traditional religion as a major threat because it offers, well, a source of meaning and purpose outside of her control.
So she needs to either co-opt religion or replace it with something else.
Exactly. They point to the rise of secular humanism and various woke ideologies as examples of this. These ideologies, while often presented as, progressive and enlightened, actually share many similarities with traditional religions. They have their own dogma, their own rituals, and their own demands for obedience.
So it's like a new religion, but without the same moral foundation.
That's one way to look at it. The sources argue that these ideologies are often just as dogmatic and intolerant as the religions they claim to replace.
This whole seven spheres framework is really starting to paint, I don't know, a disturbing picture. It's like the devouring mother has her tentacles in every aspect of our lives.
It's a pervasive dynamic, that's for sure. But the sources also remind us that the devouring mother is not all-powerful. She relies on, well, our ignorance, our fear, and our passivity.
So the more aware we are of her tactics, the less power she has over us.
Exactly. That's why they place so much emphasis on awareness, critical thinking, and taking action.
Okay, so we need to be informed, to be discerning, and to stand up for what we believe in. But what about the dragon? What role does the dragon play in all of this?
Ah, yes, the dragon. Well, the sources argue that the dragon often serves as the devouring mother's enabler, her partner in crime, so to speak.
How so? They seem like pretty different forces.
On the surface, yes. The devouring mother is all about control and order, while the dragon represents chaos and destruction. But the sources point out that these forces actually work together in a very insidious way.
Can you explain what you mean?
Think of it like this. The dragon creates the problems, the chaos, the fear, and then the devouring mother steps in, offering her solutions, her promises of, safety and security. But these solutions always come at a cost. The erosion of our freedom, the surrender of our individuality, and, well, the increase of her power.
So it's like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
The dragon knocks us down, and then the devouring mother comes in for the kill.
That's a vivid way to put it, but yes, that's essentially their argument. They see this dynamic playing out in countless ways throughout history and, well, in our own time.
Okay, can you give me a concrete example?
Well, take the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus itself, with its rapid spread and the initial uncertainty surrounding it, can be seen as a manifestation of the dragon.
Okay.
It created fear, chaos, and disruption. And then in stepped the devouring mother in the form of, governments and institutions offering their solutions, lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine passports.
And these solutions, while perhaps well-intentioned, ultimately expanded the power of the state and eroded individual liberties.
Exactly. And the sources argue that this was not a coincidence. They believe that the pandemic was exploited by those who already had a pre-existing desire for more control.
Wow, this is really starting to connect the dots. I'm seeing how this dynamic can play out on a global scale. But I'm curious, how does it manifest in our personal lives? Do we ever become the devouring mother or the dragon ourselves?
That's a profound question, and the sources actually delve into that very topic. They argue that these archetypes are not just external forces, they also exist within each of us.
So we can become the devouring mother or the dragon in our relationships with others.
Exactly. We may not be doing it on a societal scale, but we can certainly play out these roles in our families, our friendships, and our romantic relationships.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Well, think about a parent who is overly controlling of their child, who tries to micromanage every aspect of their life, who shelters them from, any form of risk or discomfort. This can be a manifestation of the devouring mother archetype.
So it's not about genuine love and care, but about a need to control.
Precisely. The devouring mother, even in her personal manifestations, is driven by this deep fear of loss and a desire to maintain control.
What about the dragon? How do we become the dragon in our personal lives?
Well, the dragon, as we discussed earlier, represents chaos and destruction, and this can manifest in our lives as self-sabotaging behaviors, addiction, rage, or any other form of destructive energy that we unleash on ourselves or others.
So we can actually embody the dragon's destructive force.
In a sense, yes. We all have the capacity for both creation and destruction within us, and the sources argue that it's important to be aware of these shadow aspects of ourselves, to acknowledge them, and to, well, work towards healing them.
Okay, this is starting to get really personal. I'm seeing how these archetypes can play out on both a grand scale and in our own individual lives. It's a bit, I don't know, scary, to be honest.
It can be unsettling to confront these darker aspects of, human nature. But the sources argue that this confrontation is necessary for our growth and liberation. They believe that by understanding these archetypes, we can start to break free from their grip and create a more conscious and fulfilling life for ourselves and for others.
Yeah, it really is empowering to think that we're not just hopeless bystanders in all of this.
Exactly. And building on that sense of agency, our sources actually spend a lot of time discussing this idea of reclaiming the heroic.
Okay, that sounds interesting. What exactly do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that our culture has become incredibly cynical, especially when it comes to this whole idea of heroism, where we're so quick to tear down anyone who, stands out, who tries to do something extraordinary.
You mean like tall poppy syndrome?
Yes. That's a perfect way to put it. The sources suggest that this constant negativity and skepticism actually plays right into the devouring mother's hands.
Because if we don't believe in heroes, we're more likely to just accept her as the protector, the one in charge.
Exactly. It feeds that sense of helplessness, that reliance on authority. So they say we need a cultural shift. We need to start recognizing and celebrating acts of courage, self-sacrifice, and even just, striving for excellence.
So it's not just about waiting for Superman, it's about recognizing the everyday heroes around us.
Yes, and it's also about cultivating that heroic spirit within ourselves. They argue that each of us has the potential for greatness, for making a positive impact on the world.
Okay, yeah, I like that. It's about reclaiming that belief in our own agency.
Yeah.
That we can be the change that we want to see.
Absolutely. And this connects beautifully to another key theme in the sources, the importance of personal responsibility.
Okay, yeah, that's something we've touched on before.
We have, but it's so central to their argument that it's worth emphasizing again. They see this whole victimhood culture that's so prevalent today as a major symptom of this societal Munchausen syndrome.
Because if we're constantly focused on who's wronged us, we're less likely to take action ourselves, right?
Exactly. It feeds into that cycle of dependence and resentment. So they say we need to shift our mindset. Instead of asking who's to blame, we should be asking, what can I do?
So it's about taking ownership of our lives, even when things are tough, right?
Precisely. Focusing on what we can control, even if it's just our own attitudes and choices, they believe that this shift in perspective is crucial for resisting this whole devouring mother-dragon dynamic.
This reminds me of something else they talked about, the role of technology in all of this. It seems like technology could either amplify these negative forces or be a tool for fighting back.
Oh, absolutely. The sources have a lot to say about technology. On the one hand, they acknowledge its incredible potential for good, for connecting people, spreading information, and, empowering individuals.
Right.
But on the other hand, they see how easily it can be used for control and manipulation.
So it's like technology is the double-edged sword. It can be used to liberate us or to, to enslave us.
That's a great way to put it. And they argue that it's up to us to be aware of the dangers and to use technology consciously, intentionally.
So like being mindful of our screen time, being critical of the information we consume online, and using social media to connect with like-minded people, people who are fighting for positive change.
Exactly. They also talk about the need for ethical guidelines for the development of artificial intelligence, ensuring that it serves humanity rather than becoming another tool for control.
It makes you think about the future. You know, if we don't get a handle on this, it feels like things could get pretty dystopian.
Yeah, they do acknowledge that possibility. They point to historical examples of societies that succumbed to tyranny, where fear and control became, well, the norm. But they also highlight societies that successfully resisted those forces.
So there's precedent for both success and failure.
Exactly, and they argue that the choices we make today will determine which path we take. They believe that the future is not predetermined, that we have the power to shape it.
Okay, that's encouraging. But if we're going to fight back against this, we need to understand the enemy, right?
Hmm.
What do the sources say about the origins of these archetypes?
Yeah.
The devouring mother and the dragon.
Oh, this is where they dive deep into mythology and history. They argue that these archetypes aren't just, modern inventions. They're ancient forces that have been at work for millennia.
Wow. So we're talking about something deeply embedded in the human psyche.
Exactly. They point to myths and stories from cultures around the world that feature, dragons or serpents as symbols of chaos, destruction, and the primal forces of nature.
And the devouring mother. Where do they see that archetype appearing throughout history?
They connect her to figures like the ancient Greek goddess Hecate, who was associated with witchcraft and the underworld, or the Hindu goddess Kali, a fierce, destructive deity who also represents creation and rebirth.
So it's not just about literal mothers, but about this overarching archetype of a force that both nurtures and destroys.
Exactly. They argue that these archetypes represent, well, fundamental aspects of human nature, both the light and the shadow.
And they believe that by understanding these archetypes, we can better understand ourselves and the challenges that we face.
Precisely. They see these myths and stories as warnings, as roadmaps for navigating the complexities of human experience.
This whole conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking. It's like you've pulled back the curtain on a hidden world, revealing the forces that have been shaping our lives without us even realizing it.
And that's exactly the point. The sources believe that awareness is the first step towards liberation. Once we see the patterns, the manipulations, the underlying dynamics, we can start to make different choices.
So what's the takeaway message here? What do you want us to do with all this knowledge?
They offer a call to action, a challenge to step into our own power and become the heroes of our own stories.
Okay. So what does that look like in practice?
It means cultivating those qualities that we've been talking about: critical thinking, courage, hope, humor, a commitment to truth.
And it means taking action,
Yeah.
both in our personal lives and in the world around us.
Exactly. It means supporting others who are fighting for freedom and justice,
Yeah.
challenging the status quo and creating a world where the devouring mother and the dragon no longer hold sway.
This has been an incredible deep dive. It's given me a whole new perspective on the world and a renewed sense of hope for the future.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, the sources remind us that we're not alone in this. There are countless others who are waking up, who are questioning, who are choosing a different path.
That's right. So what do you choose? The sources have given us the knowledge, the tools, and the inspiration. Now it's up to each of us to decide what we do with it. It's been great having you with us today. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.